Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Tuesday, December 16th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Andy Semotiuk, who is a columnist for Forbes magazine, a journalist, an author of 4 books, a longtime Ukrainian community activist, and also a U.S. and Canadian immigration attorney. Welcome, Andy. How are you?
Happy to be with you and glad that we'll spend a little bit of time together talking about Ukrainian matters.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. To start off with, can you give our audience some information about your educational and professional background?
Sure. First of all, I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, and I went to university at UBC, where I got a combined commerce law degree. Following that, I articled, which is a process that's required in Canadian law with a man named Yaroslav Butyuk in Toronto. And following that, I became a member of the Ontario Bar. And in the course of my career, I ended up also becoming a member of the New York and California bars, so that by the time I'm here talking with you, I have practiced law in Los Angeles for 10 years, New York for 5 years, and 15 years here in Toronto with Pace Law Firm.
Andy, can you share with us some background on your Ukrainian roots?
Yes. My parents were both immigrants to Canada following World War. My father came before World War II, my mother after World War II. They settled in Alberta in Western Canada, and I was raised in a Ukrainian home in Edmonton, as I mentioned. I went to PLAST, for example, Ukrainian Znaustvo, which I didn't quite complete, but nonetheless I took the courses. I've studied a little bit of Ukrainian in high school in the public school system. But I was raised as a patriotic Ukrainian. My family is connected to Solomia Krushenitska in Ukraine in historical terms. My grandmother, who I was partly raised by, was Solomia Krushenitska's sister, and she came to Los Angeles, and that's where I met her, and I was raised partly by her. Later in life, after I became a lawyer, I was engaged by the World Congress of Free Ukrainians to open up a human rights bureau in New York in the 1970s. And indeed, I became a journalist at the UN for Svoboda, writing for the Ukrainian Weekly back in the 1970s, from 75 to 78. And after that, I returned to Canada. I was prominent and a leader in several Ukrainian organizations. A notable one was the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. That's a Ukrainian snapshot.
In 2014, you published a very personal story about your mother, Solomia Drozdowska, and her life in Eastern Europe and subsequent immigration to Canada. The name of the book is A Promise Kept, a tribute to a mother's love. Can you give us some of the highlights of that book?
My mother was born in 1913. She was one of 3 children. Older sister Olena was born in 1911, and a younger brother was born after her. They grew up in Western Ukraine. My grandfather was a judge in Drohobych, oil and gas judge in Drohobych, before World War II. My grandmother was kucharka for the Sichovi Strelci during World War I. And they were both active in the Ukrainian community. My mother came down with meningitis when she was 2 years old and lost her hearing. And at 12, she came down with scarlet fever, and she lost almost all her hearing in her right ear, except for something like 20%. So she was effectively deaf. As a result, at the end of World War II, which they lived through in Lviv, in Krushenitska's building with Krushenitska, a time came where they had to part. Krushenitska stayed in Ukraine. My grandmother and my mother and my aunt Olena had to leave with with my grandfather westward, away from the invading Red Army. And earlier during the war, my uncle Leshko was arrested by the NKVD and perished in the Brigitki prison with the invasion of the German army, killed by the NKVD along with some 20,000 other intellectuals in 1941. But anyway, my mother, my aunt, my grandmother, and my grandfather all fled from Lviv, ended up in a place called Nowy Sanj, where my grandfather came down with pneumonia and died. My mother and her sister Olena left my grandmother in Nowy Sanj and traveled westward, ended up in a DP camp, and ultimately my mother ended up in Canada while my aunt Olena ended up in the United States. My mother was sponsored by my father, and she came to Edmonton in 1948. She was one of the first refugees, post-war World War II refugees, to leave Europe. I think in part because she was deaf. And then, she lived her life. I was born in Alberta, and the full story's in the book.
Okay, we'll be sure to read it. More than 50 years ago, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, you belonged to the Ukrainian Canadian Student Union, better known as SUSK. This group took a very active role in the Ukrainian Canadian multicultural movement. Please tell us about this and how it affected your future work.
It was monumental in terms of its impact on my life. I was a field worker for SUSK in 1971, and that organization sent me to Ottawa to lobby members of parliament to adopt a policy of multiculturalism for Canada. At that time, there was a discussion of Canada being a bilingual and bicultural country, English-French. But the question is, well, what about all the others? And I went to Ottawa and I lobbied members of parliament to accept a policy of bilingualism, but multiculturalism. And my work was largely facilitated by Senator Paul Muzyk, who at that time was a Ukrainian senator in the Senate of Canada. And that man allowed me to come to Parliament Hill, essentially take over his office, phone people across Canada and all the members of Parliament and whoever I wanted, arrange appointments, go see members of Parliament, argue with them about Canada being a multicultural country, try to persuade them to adopt a multicultural policy. And thereafter, actually, Canada did, not just because of me and my work, because there was a lot of other stuff that was done, conferences across Canada. The entire community was involved in this effort. But I contributed my part by lobbying members of parliament. What's more, while I was there, some Ukrainian dissidents were put under arrest and were persecuted by the Soviet Union. One such dissident was Valentin Moroz. And so we students lobbied members of parliament to raise the question of Valentin Moroz in parliamentary question period, which they did, which was an embarrassment essentially for the Soviet Union. And for the prime minister, it led to him having to look into who is this guy and other Ukrainian dissidents. And eventually, many years later, Valentin Moroz was released from the Soviet Union and actually came to Canada and the United States. And I believe he died here. Or he still may be alive. I'm not sure if he's passed on yet.
You know, this sounds like a good topic for a future book.
Could be.
Turning to your work as a U.S. and Canadian immigration attorney, what is the situation like now in Canada for Ukrainian war refugees?
Well, I'll talk about that specifically, but also mention just the general situation for Ukrainians as refugees in both countries. Canada adopted a program called the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel, CAWIT, it's called in short, that enabled Ukrainian refugees to come to Canada. And apparently there were about 300,000 that came to Canada and are here. Perhaps not that many right now, but roughly, let's say 300,000. The United States adopted a different program. They call it humanitarian parole, and ultimately it was called U4U, in which Ukrainian refugees, and the number was 100,000. Biden said they would accept 100,000 coming from Europe. And eventually there also, between those who came under that program, Ukrainians who were in the United States when the war broke out and since, and were allowed to stay under the temporary protection, TPS it's called, Temporary Protection Status Program. The United States has allowed about 300,000 Ukrainians to come there, and there are that many in the United States now. Unlike Canada, which continues to support Ukrainian refugees and has enabled them to find jobs, get health care, and their children to go to school, etc. The United States was less supportive, although they, by and large, have been able to stay in the US until today. But there are more threats that the TPS status and the humanitarian status Ukrainians have in the United States could be canceled. And I've been involved in all the, legal work related to that, to those two sort of areas.
Andy, we're just about out of time, unfortunately, but I do have a final question for you. You have played an active role in the Ukrainian diaspora, both in Canada and the U.S., throughout your life. What do you think are some of the major differences between the two communities? And how have they changed during your lifetime?
When you say two communities, you're talking about Ukrainian communities in Canada and America?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Both have been vibrant. Both have had great leaders and leadership. Both concern themselves very much with Ukraine. Canada and the Ukrainian community in Canada has made greater inroads with respect to preserving the Ukrainian language and culture here, to the extent where the deputy prime minister was Ukrainian recently, Chrystia Freeland. The United States has made great progress as well politically. Miron Koropash was a special assistant to President Ford, for example, not quite as advanced as as Canada, but surprisingly so, given the situation with Ukrainians in the United States. Ukrainians in America are more Americanized, and Ukrainians in Canada are more Canadianized. So there's a little bit of difference there in terms of accents and the views they have about life in the countries where they live and each other. So, for example, right now, the Ukrainian community in Canada is very disappointed with the direction American politics has taken with Trump and his policies regarding Ukraine. I think there's a large segment of the Ukrainian community in America who feels the same way. But surprisingly, there's also a segment of the Ukrainian community in the United States that dearly supports Trump. No matter what he does, they really like Trump. And that's something that in Canada, almost no Ukrainian would endorse. America at its best is way ahead of Canada in international affairs and in stature and capacity and in its possible help to Ukraine. But America at its worst, which is close to, it appears, where we are right now relative to Ukraine, is an enemy of Ukraine, which is a startling fact. And, that America would make this 28-point proposal to Ukraine, which essentially amounts to a surrender to Putin, is just like astounding that the leadership has gone in that direction. And we don't hear enough from Ukrainians in America criticizing their government on the directions the government has taken, although there are some very prominent, powerful voices speaking in opposition to what's going on.
Andy, thank you so much for those very interesting observations about the differences between the two diaspora communities in Canada and the U.S. And thank you for joining us today on Krynytsia.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Michael.
I have been speaking with Andy Semotiuk, who is a columnist for Forbes magazine, a journalist and author of 4 books, a longtime Ukrainian community activist both in Canada and the U.S., and also a U.S. and Canadian immigration attorney. This episode of Krynytsia has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, the host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.